Okay, so now we're moving on to World War II and looking at the causes of the war. So Hoover's foreign policy was one of isolationism. After World War One, every president was like, you know what, we don't want to get involved in world affairs that caused problems for us before. We don't want to get involved. So we did have some problems with isolation, where there was Japanese aggression in Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations had absolutely no power to enforce their decisions, causing kind of worldwide chaos. And we pulled our US troops out of Latin America. FDR comes in, and his foreign policies included a good neighbor policy where we were a good neighbor in the Western Hemisphere, available to help others in the Western Hemisphere. The Pan American Conferences were created in 1933 and pledged never again to intervene in internal affairs in Latin American countries. And we also warned against European aggression in Latin America in 1936. As for Cuba, we got rid of the Platt Amendment, we kept Guantanamo Bay, let Cuba do their own thing. As for economic diplomacy, we recognized that the Soviet Union existed, which was a big step because Republican presidents of the 1920s refused to grant diplomatic recognition to the communist regime that ruled the Soviet Union. FDR granted that recognition in 1933 to increase US trade and boost the economy. As for the Philippines, remember we were kind of controlling them. In 1934, we provided for their independence by 1946 with a gradual removal of the US. And we had reciprocal trade agreements, which reduced the tariffs by up to 50% for nations that reciprocated with comparable reductions for US imports. In Italy in 1922, Benito Mussolini rose into power with the Fascist Party. He attracted dissatisfied war veterans from World War I. He attracted nationalists and anybody who was afraid of rising communism. Now, fascism, as you should remember from your previous years in world history, was the idea that people should glorify their nation and their race through an aggressive show of force. In Germany, the Nazi Party rose up in the 1920s as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, basically, and the terrible economic conditions. Adolf Hitler bullied Jews, and he used fascist ideology to increase his popularity with the German workers. He gained control of the legislature in 1933. We'll talk more about these guys later. In Japan, you have nationalists and militarists. They invaded China and Southeast Asia, wanting oil, tin, and iron to help build up their military industrial complex. They also created the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which basically meant we're going to be a bully and do whatever we want. So, continuation of American isolationism, we established the Neutrality Acts of 1935 to 1937. In 1935, it authorized the president to block all arms shipments and to forbid U.S. citizens to travel on the ships of belligerent nations. So we're starting to see Italy, Japan, Germany rise up as belligerent nations during this time. In 1936, we forbade the extension of loans and credits to these belligerents. And then in 1937, forbade the shipments of arms to the opposing sides in the Civil War in Spain. Because remember, Spain was kind of doing its own thing at this point with its Civil War. The Spanish Civil War started in 1936 as an ideological struggle, fascism versus republicanism. Americans and FDR sympathized with the Loyalists, but couldn't aid because of the Neutrality Acts. And fascists ended up establishing a military dictatorship in 1939. The top picture that you see is Guernica, which was bombed extensively. And then the bottom piece is Guernica, which was a piece by Pablo Picasso demonstrating the pain and the damage brought by the bombing of Guernica. As for American isolationism, we continue with the America First Committee, which was afraid of FDR's pro-British policies and mobilized public opinion against World War II. We have appeasement in Ethiopia with Mussolini, the Rhineland with Hitler, China with Japan and China, and the Sudetenland in 1938 again with Hitler. Basically, this was this idea that, you know what, it's kind of like the screaming kid in a grocery store. You just want to calm him down, so you give him the piece of candy. This is kind of what it was. So these guys started moving into these territories, and the rest of the world was like, okay, maybe if we give this to you, you're going to stop screaming and you're going to stop being a problem, and this will just go away. Guess what? It didn't. So preparedness for us focused on neutrality while building up our arms and military base. The outbreak of the war in Europe started in August 1939 when the Soviet Union and Germany created the Non-Aggression Pact, which agreed to both invade Poland and then divide it between them. So this took place on September 1st, where Germany invaded Poland and then Britain and France declared war. The Soviet Union invaded Poland and the Baltic countries from the eastern side, kind of meeting in the middle. So Blitzkrieg was a German offensive strategy. It was lightning war. It was an overwhelming use of air power and fast-moving tanks to get what they wanted. So if you look at the map here, you can see Poland smack dab between Germany and the Soviet Union. The U.S. now started to kind of change their policy a little bit. Now in 1939, we have the cash and carry policy, which said that a belligerent could buy U.S. arms if it used its own ships and paid cash. Technically, it's a neutral policy, but it strongly favored Britain because the British Navy controlled the seas. A lot of Americans felt that World War I was a mistake, and it served for the greed of bankers and arms manufacturers, so a lot of people still wanted to remain isolationist. We also have the Selective Service Act in 1940, which provided for the registration of all American men between the ages of 21 and 35 for the training of them as potentially people for the military. So that's the draft. That's what you guys will have to, men for now, register for when you turn 18. The Destroyers for Bases deal was established in September 1940, where Britain was under constant attack by German bombing raids. So FDR said, you know what, Britain, you'll get 50 older but still serviceable U.S. destroyers, and then we get the right to build military bases on British islands in the Caribbean. In the election of 1940, FDR campaigned for his third term. He said, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. Oh, how times change. Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate, criticized the New Deal, criticized FDR's decision to break the two-term tradition established by George Washington. FDR won with 54% of the popular vote thanks to his strong economic recovery enhanced by defense purchases and a fear of war, which caused voters to stay with the more experienced leader. Now, FDR started to create this arsenal of democracy. It was his policy for how to demonstrate a stronger U.S. position. Started with the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. In March of 1941, he established the Lend-Lease Act, which permitted Britain to obtain all the U.S. arms it needed on credit. FDR compared it to lending a garden hose to a next-door neighbor whose house is on fire. Doesn't do a whole lot, but it might do a little. The Atlantic Charter affirmed the general principles for a sound peace after the war, written by Churchill and FDR. And then they essentially established a shoot-on-sight policy with undeclared naval war on Germany. As for Japan during this time period, in the 1930s, it invaded and brutalized Manchuria and China. They sought military and economic domination over Asia, which you can see on the map, the extensive Japanese expansion from the 1920s to 1941. Japan joined the Axis powers in September of 1940. The U.S. prohibited the export of steel and scrap iron to all countries except for Britain and nations of the Western Hemisphere. We froze all Japanese credits in the U.S., and cut off Japanese access to vital materials like oil. Japan wasn't so hot about that. So the U.S. fleet in the Pacific was anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, 2,400 Americans were killed, almost 1,200 were wounded, and 20 warships were sunk or severely damaged, with approximately 20 airplanes destroyed. FDR called it a date which will live in infamy. It was a partial surprise to us. We knew that there would be an attack somewhere in the Pacific because they had broken Japanese codes, but they didn't know the exact target or the exact date. So Congress declared war on December 8th against Japan. Italy and Germany honored their treaty with Japan and declared war against the U.S., and this is when we see the U.S. join World War II.